Welcome to Traditional Investing is Dead, the podcast. My name is Douglas Muir, and I am the CEO and founder of the Family Business Fund. We have Richard Hilson from Hilson Consulting on here today, and it's a real honor. If you want to know anything about alternative investments, he was in this business like probably when I was in college. I know he looks a lot younger than me, and he is. But he's been in this since the beginning, and he's watched this alternative investment wave just start coming about us, especially since yields are coming down. And we're just honored to have him. Thank you, Richard, for being on our podcast.
You flatter me. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me as your guest.
Tell us how you got into alternative investments and how you were just so far ahead of the power curve.
I founded an investment bank back in 2011, which started as a private equity shop. And it was the rationale for setting up an investment bank was we were going to invest money in projects we liked and we wanted to bring in other money behind us. And that morphed over, let's call it 7-8 years or so, to become a boutique alts firm. And that was really because as the market started to open up, as minimum investment ticket sizes dropped, as alts became more commonplace, it wasn't just the kind of family office co-investment opportunity situations. It was becoming more and more obvious that alts were going to be available for, you'd call it the mass affluent sector, rather than just the ultra high net worth family office.
What actually is an alternative investment?
The dictionary definition says alternatives are anything that's not a stock, a bond, or cash. Whether it's a conservative commercial real estate yield play, whether it's oil and gas royalties, which are predictable cash flows, or Bobby Axelrod from Billions, black box hedge fund strategies, which terrify most clients, or crazy stuff like investing in whiskey casks in Ireland and Scotland, to antiques, to vintage cars. It's just a broad, the broad definition does the industry a disservice, because the amount of times I have a conversation with an advisor or a client and you say the word alternatives and they act like you've just dropped the F-bomb, is their shoulders tense up and they're just terrified, because they just see this broad definition which involves some highly exotic, crazy, volatile things, and it doesn't need to.
The way I stumbled into this, like I stumbled into everything my whole life, is a friend of mine called me up and said, hey, I have a REIT. And I'm like, okay, what's a REIT? He goes, it's a real estate investment trust, and I'm paying 12.5%. I'm like, you can't pay 12.5%. He goes, it's an alternative investment. I can pay whatever I want. I need you to write this PPM. I'm like, what's a PPM? He goes, a private placement memorandum, which tells you exactly what I'm going to do with your money, how I'm going to do it, how I'm going to mark everything about it. And I called up my financial advisor and I was like, yo, how come you never told me about these REITs? He says, well, everything is, he was just telling me how risky everything was. And, 3 years later, I'm still making 12.5% with this real estate investment trust with like barely no risk, and I'm getting such high yield. So why do you think it is that financial advisors won't talk about this? Like, who are your clients?
So I sometimes work with product sponsors to help the education in the space, to essentially help their outreach to what I think is the largest untapped area of the market, which is the sub 500 million advisor who's could have a load of high net worth accredited investors. But I think part of the problem, and I'm actually writing an article about this at the moment, is that an advisor can charge 1%, whether it's investing in Microsoft, Google, Amazon, or whether it's in alts. Their fee stays the same. And therefore, there's not always that kick up the backside to actually get outside of their comfort zone, because they will be charging the same fee. And why would they do that for something that, and I will say deemed to have more risk and more compliance and regulatory issues, and therefore stay in the comfort zone when the equity markets have been as kind as they have for the last few years? My message is, number one, okay, if we have to scare you by hitting you in the paycheck here is what happens when you're over allocated to equity but gets desecrated by 40% when we have this long overdue sustained market correction.
Yeah.
And then second of all is if someone actually gets the message that they need to evolve or die.
Talked about an RIA, registered investment advisor, a financial advisor, if you will. How do you explain to them how they should measure success with alternative investments?
So I'm a big fan of yield plays in the alt space at the moment. Is I think I get daily calls about crypto, and I've got nothing against crypto, but it's contradictory to my message. Is that if I'm trying to get the message across, is that there's misconceptions about alts. Alts can be stable, predictable, and less volatile than some stock plays. If I then ring up and say, "Hey, there's this thing called Dogecoin," I'm just completely contradicting my message. So for me, I like conservative alternatives. If I can get 5 or 6% in a less volatile and fairly predictable play, even if it's illiquid, I'll take that all day because you have to. The sponsor has to pay that premium to basically get you to do something that's illiquid rather than something with the same yield that's liquid. So there's a lot of really good yield out there because
Yes.
illiquid alts need to provide an incentive, and that is typically yield.
We have a spreadsheet over here, right? And then we have equities over here, and we have alternatives. And so let's just say equities versus alternatives, and the top says risk. Tell me the difference. What do you think right now with the overheated market? What is the risk differential between the two?
There's a lot of alternatives which are less volatile and less risky than middle of the market equity plays at the moment, given what I think is an overheated equity market. I'm not even talking about the volatile stocks. I'm talking about middle of the range blue chip stocks. I think
Wow.
there's alt plays that are less volatile and less risky than that. I did a transaction recently, which is an investment into an Amazon distribution facility with a nice yield in it. You're basically gambling on the credit worthiness and the default risk of Amazon, at which point I'll take that pretty much every day versus anything that I deem to be overpriced in the equity market. And then people say, well, what happens if the commercial real estate market gets massacred in the next few years and that property's worth 20% less? Guess what? I'll hold it for 10 years then. I'm not sitting there on a paper gain. I'm getting a 5% or so yield. And
Yeah.
therefore, I'm not looking to make 20%, 50% on the exit. I'm looking for the yield, return of capital with yield, and maybe a kicker at the end if possible. But if the market's in a state as far as the commercial real estate market, I'm fine holding that for a bit longer because I'm getting my yield, which I'm not getting in cash and I'm not getting in the bond market. So I don't think that this illiquidity is your enemy.
How much do people typically earn if you put alt in a 100% box? What's the average payback, do you think?
We're seeing, 4 to 6% yields on some pretty conservative alts, which I think should be taking the place of bond yields rather than the bond yields going into the equity
Oh,
market.
that's a good point.
If I'm an advisor, I'm taking
Yeah.
some of the historical bond allocation and
Yeah.
allocating to yield-based alts rather than into equities, which is just increasing the overall risk of the portfolio exponentially.
Richard, this has been, I've been taking notes over here. I hope you don't mind. I haven't been looking away. This is, especially about the bond. I like that where you can get an alt at a 4 or 5%, which is more stable than the bonds, which are paying, as you know, they're paying nothing today. Ladies and gentlemen, we're speaking to Richard Hilson of Hilson Consulting. He's an expert in alternative investing. And that's what my podcast is all about. It's taken us weeks to get him on because he's so busy, and we appreciate that. We're going to put his information all over here at the end, so that if you want to get in touch with them, especially you financial advisors, not that we're hitting on you, not that we're picking on you, but we want you to know that if you're going to differentiate yourself from the 333,000 financial advisors out there, you may want to start looking at alternative investments. My name is Douglas Muir, and this is Traditional Investing is Dead. Richard, thank you so much for all your knowledge and for sharing that information with our folks on this podcast. And we'll see you soon.
Thank you, everyone.